The operating room at Kendall Peak Medical Center had seen bad nights before, but nothing like this one. Blood sheeted across the floor in a slow, dark tide. The attending surgeon, Dr. Marcus Holt, stood motionless at the table, both gloved hands hovering over an open chest cavity, his face a mask of something nobody in that room wanted to name. The monitors were screaming, the anesthesiologist was calling numbers nobody was responding to, and a 53-year-old man was dying by degrees on the table while 12 trained medical professionals watched the clock instead of each other. Then a scrub nurse in the back of the room set down the instrument tray she'd been holding for the last 4 minutes and walked forward. Nobody stopped her. Not because they approved, but because not one of them knew what else to do. Her name was Nora Vance. She was 38 years old, worked day shifts in the surgical prep unit, and as far as anyone at Kendall Peak knew, she had an associate's degree from a community college program, 8 years of floor nursing, and a habit of eating lunch alone. What happened next would take weeks to explain and months to understand. And when the truth finally came out about who Nora Vance really was and what she'd left behind, nothing at that hospital would ever be the same. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because what's coming is going to hit harder than you expect. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Kendall Peak Medical Center sat at the edge of Sutter Falls, a mid-sized city in eastern Oregon that had grown faster than its infrastructure could handle. The hospital had expanded 3 times in 12 years. New wings bolted onto old ones, departments shuffled and reshuffled, staff perpetually stretched thin. It was the kind of place where people worked long hours for modest salaries and told themselves they were doing it for the patients, which was sometimes true and sometimes a story they needed to believe. Nora Vance had been there for 2 years and 11 months. She'd come in quietly, applied through a staffing agency, passed her credentialing review without issue, and slotted herself into the surgical prep rotation like someone who'd been doing exactly this kind of work for a long time. She was competent, she was reliable. She arrived early and stayed late when the census spiked, which it did often. She never made requests for overtime pay, never complained about assignments, and never asked to be moved to a higher visibility unit. That last part bothered some people more than they could articulate. "She just sits there," said Danny Cho, one of the OR nurses who'd worked Kendall Peak for 6 years and considered herself an informal authority on the social dynamics of the surgical floor. "Like she's waiting for something. It's weird." "She's quiet," said Paul, the charge nurse, who was generous by nature and tired by circumstance. "Not everyone needs to perform." "I'm not saying she needs to perform. I'm saying she doesn't talk to anyone. She doesn't go to drinks after shift. She doesn't complain about anything," which, honestly, more suspicious than complaining. Paul had no good answer for that, so he'd let it go. What Danny wasn't wrong about was the waiting quality. There was something in the way Nora moved through the unit, unhurried but precise, always positioned slightly off-center from wherever the action was, watching without appearing to watch. That read less like shyness and more like discipline, like someone who'd spent years training themselves to take up less space than they actually occupied. The surgical staff didn't know what to do with her. The attendings largely ignored her. Dr. Marcus Holt, the department's most senior cardiothoracic surgeon, had said exactly 4 words to Nora in 3 years. Clamp, suction, good, and once, memorably, "Who are you?" Not as a question, but as a dismissal, directed at her back as she was already moving to the supply cart. She hadn't answered. She'd handed him what he needed before he'd finished asking for it, and he'd turned back to the table without acknowledgement. That was the baseline. That was the working relationship. So when the night of March 14th went sideways, nobody in that OR was prepared for what came next. The patient's name was Douglas Farr. He was a regional contractor, father of 2, history of coronary artery disease that he'd managed poorly for the better part of a decade. He'd come in through the ER at 9:15 with chest pain that the attending correctly identified as an acute dissection, a tear in the aortic wall that was, without intervention, going to kill him within hours. He'd been rushed to the OR by 9:50, prepped, anesthetized, and opened by 10:20. By 11:03, things had gone wrong in a way that wasn't fully anyone's fault and wasn't fully no one's fault either. The dissection had extended further than the imaging suggested. What Holt had expected to be a controlled repair had become a race against hemorrhage, and somewhere in the pivot between procedures, between the plan they'd rehearsed and the reality they were facing, the rhythm of the room had broken down. The perfusionist was managing bypass. The first assistant was working the field. Holt was standing very still, and the stillness had started about 4 minutes ago, and nobody had said anything about it. "Pressure's dropping," the anesthesiologist called. 62/40 and falling. The first assistant looked at Holt. Holt looked at the open chest cavity. His hands were above the field, not in it. "Dr. Holt." That was the scrub tech, a 24-year-old named Marco who was trying very hard to keep his voice neutral. "Do you want the felt pledgets? I have them ready." Holt didn't answer. The monitors changed pitch. And Nora Vance, who had been standing at the back of the room managing the instrument count with the kind of focused quiet that nobody ever noticed, set down her clipboard, crossed the floor in 6 steps, and said, clearly and without inflection, "I need someone to step aside." It was the kind of sentence that should have generated immediate pushback. Instead, the first assistant, a third-year fellow named Dana Marsh, who had been working 12-hour days for 6 consecutive weeks and was running on muscle memory and anxiety, stepped back without thinking. Nora stepped up to the table. Her hands went into the field. What happened in the next 11 minutes was something that the people in that room would describe differently depending on who was asking and how much time had passed. Marco would later say it was the most efficient repair work he'd ever seen, and he'd scrubbed with 3 separate chiefs of surgery. Dana Marsh would say she hadn't understood half of what Nora was doing in real time. Only that the bleeding stopped, the pressure stabilized, and when Nora stepped back and said, "He's going to need the proximal suture reinforced before you close," her voice was the same even tone it always was. Holt had emerged from wherever he'd gone, the blank, distant place that sometimes took experienced surgeons when they hit a wall they couldn't see past, and was back at the table by the time the crisis had resolved. He looked at the field. He looked at Nora. He looked at the monitors, which were reading 78/50 and climbing. "What did you do?" he said. "Temporary hemostasis," she said. "The posterior defect was larger than it appeared. I controlled the bleed until you were ready to close." It was not technically an answer to the question he was asking. But Holt, who was a complicated man and not always an easy one, was also a surgeon first, and what he saw in front of him was a patient who was alive when he should have been dead. He turned back to the table and began closing. Nobody said anything else until the case was finished. By morning, the story had moved through the unit with the particular velocity that hospital gossip achieves when it involves something genuinely strange. The details mutated as they traveled. By the time it reached the nursing station on the 4th floor, Nora had apparently performed a full aortic replacement single-handedly while Holt stood in the corner. But the core of it remained consistent. Something had happened in OR3 the night before, and the scrub nurse from surgical prep was at the center of it. Nora arrived for her shift at 6:50, poured herself a cup of coffee that she didn't drink, and opened her locker. Danny Cho was waiting for her. "So," Danny said. "Morning," said Nora. "That's all you've got? Morning?" "It's what I usually say." Danny leaned against the adjacent locker. She was not a malicious person, but she was a persistent one, and the combination of her natural nosiness and genuine bewilderment about the previous night had been building since she'd gotten the call from Marco at midnight. "Marco says you went into the field in an active hemorrhage on a cardiothoracic case." "I assisted." "You're a prep nurse, Nora." "I'm aware." "That's not—" Danny stopped, started again. "That's not something a prep nurse does. That's not something most floor nurses could do. Where did you learn to do that?" Nora looked at her for a moment, not coldly. There was never anything cold about the way she engaged with people, which was part of what made her so hard to read. "I've had a lot of training," she said. "Excuse me." She took her coffee and went to check her assignment board. Behind her, Danny stood in the locker room and thought about the 11 words she'd just been given, and how they explained absolutely nothing. By noon, the rumor had reached administration. The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Lena Ferris, heard it from her assistant, who'd heard it from one of the OR schedulers. Ferris was a methodical woman with a reputation for thoroughness that some people described as an asset and others described as exhausting. She pulled Nora's personnel file herself rather than delegating it, which told her assistant something about how seriously she was taking this. The file was clean, unexceptional. Associate's degree from Cascadia Community College, nursing licensure in good standing, 8 years of documented floor experience at 2 previous employers, nothing flagged. The credentialing packet was complete. References had checked out. It was a perfectly ordinary file. Ferris read it twice. Then she called Human Resources. "I want a secondary review on Vance N. Surgical Prep," she said. "Full credentialing audit, quiet, nothing that goes to the floor." "What are we looking for?" "I don't know yet," Ferris said. "That's the problem." Nora, for her part, spent the afternoon doing her job. She prepped 2 elective cases and 1 semi-urgent lap trolle, managed her supply count with the precision that had earned her exactly 0 compliments in 3 years, and ate lunch in the small break room near the service elevator that most people avoided because the HVAC unit above it made a grinding sound every 40 minutes. She was on her second sandwich when Dr. Holt appeared in the doorway. He was not a man who visited break rooms. This was simply known. He ate at his desk or in the physician's lounge and gave the impression that casual spaces made him slightly irritable, the way formal clothing makes some people irritable, not hostile, just ill-fitting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. "You're the nurse from last night," he said. "Vance," she said. "Nora Vance." He came in, which surprised her. He didn't sit, just stood near the counter with his arms crossed, the way tall people sometimes do when they're trying to take up less space than their height demands. "I want to understand what you did." "I explained it this morning. You explained the mechanics. I want to understand the rest of it." He paused. "I've been operating for 22 years. I know what a controlled hemostasis repair looks like. What you did last night was not something people learn in a community college program." Nora put down her sandwich. She looked at him with the same steady, unreadable expression she'd worn through everything. "I've had additional training," she said, "outside of formal credentialing." "What kind of additional training?" "The kind that doesn't show up in a personnel file." Holt studied her. He was not easily unsettled. 2 decades in cardiothoracic surgery had given him a fairly comprehensive inventory of things that could go wrong and a proportional calm about most of them. But this woman, eating a sandwich in a room that smelled like machine oil, deflecting his questions with the patience of someone who'd deflected much harder questions than these, was unsettling him in a way he couldn't categorize. "The patient survived," he said finally. "Yes." "His family was notified this morning. He's in stable condition." "Good." "You're not going to ask me to thank you?" "No," she said. "I'm not." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and walked out, and Nora listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor and finished her sandwich in the grinding, reliable silence of the break room. 3 days later, Human Resources completed their secondary review and found nothing. Lena Ferris was informed, thanked them, and sat with the file open on her desk for a long time afterward. What she was sitting with was not evidence. It was the absence of it, which was a different problem. She called Dr. Holt. "The Vance situation," she said. "I understand you spoke with her." "Briefly." "And?" A pause. "She's skilled," he said, "beyond what her file indicates. Whether that's a problem or not depends on what she's doing here." "That's what I'm trying to determine." Ferris tapped a pen against her desk. "In the meantime, I'm going to request she be restricted to non-surgical support roles pending review." Another pause. Longer. "On what grounds?" "Scope of practice concerns." "Scope of practice," Holt repeated. His tone had shifted in a way that was hard to define. Not quite disagreement, but not endorsement either. "She saved the patient." "I know she did. That's not the point." "Then I'm not sure I understand the point." "The point," Ferris said carefully, "is that a nurse with credentials we cannot verify performed an interventional procedure in an active surgical field. Whether the outcome was positive or not, we have a liability question. We have a protocol question. And until we can answer those questions, I need her out of surgical rotation. Holt didn't argue further. He said, "Fine," and they ended the call. That same afternoon, Paul, the charge nurse, the generous one, was summoned to Ferris's office and given the reassignment directive. He walked back to the unit looking like a man delivering news he didn't believe in. He found Nora at the supply station, doing inventory. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "I've been asked to—" He stopped. "They're moving you to floor support, non-surgical assignments." Nora was quiet for a moment. Her hands, which had been moving through the inventory count with automatic efficiency, went still. "Pending review?" "Yeah." "How long?" "They didn't say." She nodded. She put the clipboard down with the same care she used for everything. "Okay," she said. "Nora, it's fine, Paul." "It's not fine," he said, and his voice had something in it. Frustration, guilt, the particular discomfort of a person who knows they're part of a system doing something wrong and doesn't have the standing or the energy to fight it. You saved a man's life, and they're treating it like you broke a rule. "I did break a rule." "You know that's not the—" "It's okay," she said again. Her voice was the same. It was always the same, not flat, not defeated, just steady in a way that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I'll take the floor assignments." She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. "For what it's worth," Paul said behind her, "Holt didn't push back, on the record." Nora paused in the doorway, her back to him. "I know," she said. "He wouldn't." She left. Paul stood there for a moment, looking at the clipboard she'd put down, the inventory count half finished and perfectly legible. He finished it himself. It took him 4 times as long as it would have taken her. The thing about Sutter Falls was that it was the kind of city that had a long memory for its own stories and a short one for everyone else's. There was a population of about 140,000, a university in the North End, a river that had flooded 3 times in the last decade, and a civic identity that came from somewhere between genuine community pride and a slight defensiveness about not being Portland. People here knew their neighbors. They noticed things. Nobody noticed Nora Vance. She lived in a second-floor apartment on Decker Street, 12 minutes from the hospital, and had lived there for 2 years and 10 months. Her landlord, a retired teacher named Barbara Wills, described her as excellent, quiet, prompt with rent, occasionally helpful in ways that were unexpected. "She fixed my furnace," Barbara said when asked. "I didn't ask her to. I just mentioned it was making a noise. She had it running in 40 minutes. The neighbors on either side knew her only by sight. One had received a package mistakenly delivered to her address and described returning it to a woman who thanked her and offered coffee she didn't seem to expect to be accepted. She went running in the early morning. She did her grocery shopping on Tuesdays. She owned no pet, had no visitors, drove a 7-year-old Subaru that was due for new tires, and read books, physical ones from the library, that tended toward history and structural engineering and occasionally dense medical reference texts that she checked out without apparent embarrassment and returned on time. She was, by every available measurement, unremarkable. On her 4th day of floor support assignments, Nora was given a medication reconciliation audit on the post-surgical ward, a task that required a level of precision that most nurses found tedious and she found soothing. She was working her way through the chart stack when a resident named Dr. Kyle Osmond came out of a patient room looking harassed and noticed her at the workstation. "Vance," he said, "you're the one from the OR thing." She didn't look up from the chart. "Yes." He leaned against the counter. He was 29, 3 months into his residency, and operated on a sustained frequency of low-grade anxiety that came out as chattiness. "People are saying you went into a live surgical field without authorization." "People are saying a lot of things." "Is it true?" She looked up at him. "I helped stabilize a patient during an active bleed." "Yes." "That's wild," he said, with the artless appreciation of someone young enough to still find things genuinely remarkable. "Where'd you learn to do that?" She returned to the chart. "I had good instructors." "Like where? Specialty program? Trauma certification?" He was leaning closer now, genuinely curious, the kind of curious that wasn't strategic or suspicious, just a person who wanted to know. Because the stuff Marco described doesn't sound like any certification course I've heard of. Nora finished the line she was on before she answered. It was a different kind of program, she said, not hospital-based. Like what? Wilderness medicine? Combat applications? She looked at him. I'm pre-coffee, he said, by way of apology. Sorry, that was a weird leap. She returned to the chart without confirming or denying, and after a moment he moved on to wherever he'd been going, and the ward settled back into its ordinary Tuesday rhythm. But he'd seen the pause. He'd seen the fraction of a second between his question and her non-answer, the way her hands had stilled on the page. He thought about it for the rest of his shift without quite knowing why. On the 7th day, the situation escalated in a direction nobody had anticipated. A man was admitted through the ER in the early afternoon, non-emergent officially, but attended by 2 individuals in civilian clothing who moved with the practiced unobtrusiveness of people who are paid not to be seen and are very good at their jobs. The patient was registered under the name Harold Weston, 61, cardiac evaluation. He was a lean man, gray at the temples, with the particular quality of stillness that Nora, who understood stillness better than most, recognized as something other than infirmity. He was still the way people were still when they'd spent years making it a habit. When the ward nurse brought him to his room and he caught sight of Nora at the medication station down the hall, something crossed his face that was over in less than a second. Then he looked away. Nora continued her chart work. 90 minutes later, one of the civilian-clothed attendants came to the nursing station and said, with the carefully polite firmness of someone exercising authority they don't feel they need to justify, Mr. Weston is requesting Nurse Vance for his medication review. The ward nurse, a woman named Gloria, looked up from her computer. That's not really how we... He's specifically requesting her. He knows her? He'd like his medication review done by Nurse Vance. Gloria looked down the hall at Nora, who had not moved from the station and was not looking in their direction. She had the feeling, which she couldn't have explained and wouldn't have tried to, that Nora had heard every word of the exchange despite the 30 feet of corridor between them. I'll ask her, Gloria said. She walked to the station. Hey, room 412 is asking for you specifically. Patient named Weston. Do you know him? Nora's pen moved through one more line on the chart. I'll go see him, she said. She walked to room 412. She closed the door behind her. The man in the bed was watching her with an expression she'd last seen on a different continent, in a different decade, under circumstances she'd spent years trying to reconstruct into something she could live with. Captain, he said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into water, the silence afterward spreading outward in all directions. Mr. Weston, she said. It's still General, actually. Retired, but it stays. His voice was dry, which she remembered about him. He'd always been dry. I heard you were here. Took me 6 months to believe it. You should have kept not believing it. I would have, he said. Except my cardiologist is on the floor below this one, and I'm genuinely here for a valve evaluation, so... He shifted against the pillows. The cover is mutual. Nora stood near the window with her clipboard. Outside, the afternoon was clear and cold. The mountains visible at the edge of the city, snow still on the upper elevations. She kept her eyes on the chart. What do you want, General? Nothing yet, he said. I wanted to see you. I wanted to know you were... He stopped. There was a situation in OR3 last week. You heard about that. Word moves faster than you think it does, even in civilian sectors. He studied her. He was not a man given to sentiment. She knew this about him, had always known it. But there was something in his face that wasn't quite sentiment and wasn't quite its opposite. You went into an active field. The surgeon was compromised. The patient was dying. You couldn't have let it go. No, she said. I couldn't. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been here? In Sutter Falls? Almost 3 years. Before that? That's not a question you need an answer to. Fair enough. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Things are moving, Vance. There are people who've been looking for a way to correct what happened, to correct the record. It's been a long process. I don't need anything corrected. I know you don't think you do. She looked at him then, actually looked at him, which she'd been carefully not doing since she entered the room. He was older. They both were. He'd aged in the specific way that people in high-pressure careers aged, quickly for a while and then not at all, like the process just ran out of material. "General," she said, "I left that life. I built something here. Quiet. Sustainable. I know. I'm asking you to let me keep it." He met her gaze. He did not agree and he did not disagree, which told her exactly what she needed to know. "Your medication schedule is straightforward," she said, returning to the clipboard. "You're on a standard pre-procedural protocol. I'll have the notes updated before shift change." She walked to the door. "Vance," he said. She stopped, hand on the frame. "He survived," the general said. "The soldier. He has a family, 2 kids." She didn't turn around. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. She stood there for 3 seconds. Then she walked out, closed the door without sound, and returned to the medication station. Gloria was watching her from across the hall with the expression of someone who had picked up on something they couldn't name. "All set?" Gloria asked. "All set," Nora said. She picked up the next chart and continued working, but her hands, for the first time in a very long time, were not entirely steady. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, a retired general stared at the ceiling and made a quiet phone call to a number that very few people had. And the gears of something much larger and much slower than any single hospital floor began, almost imperceptibly, to turn. The phone call lasted 4 minutes. Nora knew this because she counted. Not deliberately. It was an old habit, the way some people counted steps on stairs or seconds between lightning and thunder. She was 3 rooms down the hall, updating a medication log, and she could see the general's door from the corner of her eye without appearing to look at it. The attendant who'd been standing outside stepped in at the 3-minute mark and came back out at 4. His expression hadn't changed, but the quality of his stillness had. The way a dog goes still when it hears something in the distance, not alarmed yet, just listening forward. She finished the log, clipped it to the chart, and did not look down the hall again. That evening she drove home the long way, which she didn't usually do. Not because she was afraid of being followed, she wasn't, or not in any way she could verify, but because she needed the extra 12 minutes to get her hands back to where they belonged. By the time she parked on Decker Street, they were fine, steady. She sat in the car for a moment anyway, watching the streetlight come on at the corner, and thought about what the general had said. He survived. He has a family, 2 kids. She'd known he survived. She'd known that much from the beginning, from the moment the evacuation helicopter had lifted off, and she'd watched it from the ground, her hands covered in blood that wasn't hers, standing in a place she wasn't supposed to be doing something she wasn't supposed to have done. She'd known he survived because she'd made sure of it. What came after? That was the part she'd spent 3 years not thinking about. She went upstairs. She made dinner. She did not sleep especially well. The formal complaint against Nora was filed on a Monday morning, 9 days after the OR3 incident, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. Dr. Randall Sproat was not the most senior physician at Kendall Peak, but he was among the most visible: department chair for surgical services, point person for the hospital's accreditation cycle, and a man who had, over 15 years, cultivated a specific version of himself that required a specific kind of environment to sustain. He was competent. He was also the kind of competent that needed to be the most competent in the room, and the two things were not always compatible. He filed the complaint under the heading of unauthorized clinical intervention and listed 4 specific violations of hospital protocol, all of which were technically accurate. He also requested, in a separate internal memo that Lena Ferris received the same morning, that Nora Vance be placed on administrative suspension pending a full credentialing investigation. "This is about liability," he told Ferris when she called him. "A nurse going into a live surgical field without authorization. If that patient had died instead of recovered, we'd be looking at a lawsuit that would cost this hospital 7 figures minimum." "The patient didn't die," Ferris said. "That's not the point. You're the second person to say that to me this week." "Because it's true." He was very smooth on the phone, which she'd noticed before. The smoothness was a professional asset and a personal quality she'd never quite trusted. "We have protocols. Those protocols exist for a reason. If we allow exceptions because an outcome happened to be positive, We are undermining the entire framework. Ferris was quiet for a moment. I'm not suggesting malice, Sproat added. The nurse may have excellent intentions, but excellent intentions don't determine scope of practice. I'll review the complaint, Ferris said. I'll let you know. She reviewed it. By the end of the day, Nora had been notified of her suspension, paid, pending investigation, effective immediately. Paul delivered the news in the same corridor where he'd told her about the reassignment, and his face had the same expression, only worse. This isn't right, he said. I know. Sproat pushed for this. He went around the CMO's initial review. I know, she said again. Do you want to, I don't know, file something, contest it? I can help you draft. Paul? She picked up her bag from the locker. How long have you worked here? 11 years? Then you know how this goes. He did. That was the worst part. He knew exactly how it went. The complaint, the suspension, the investigation that took long enough for the story to change shape, for people to forget the original context, for the person at the center of it to become associated with the problem rather than the solution. He'd watched it happen twice before, to different people, for different reasons. He knew the shape of it. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. Go do your job. She closed her locker. Keep an eye on the med reconciliation on 4. Osman is thorough, but he rushes the cross-reference step when he's tired. She walked out. But Sproat called a department meeting 2 days later, which was unusual enough to generate its own layer of speculation. The surgical staff gathered in the second-floor conference room, attendings, fellows, the senior scrub team, and he stood at the front of the room with the particular posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say, but wanted it to appear unrehearsed. I want to be clear that the action taken regarding Nurse Vance is not punitive, he said. It's procedural. We have an obligation to verify credentials and ensure that clinical interventions are performed within established scope of practice. That's not negotiable, regardless of individual circumstances. Dana Marsh, the fellow who'd stepped back in OR3, was sitting in the second row. She had been thinking about that night for 9 days, replaying it, mostly, the particular quality of her own step backward, which had not felt like a choice at the time and felt less like one the more she examined it. She raised her hand. Yes, Sproat said. The patient was in active hemorrhage. There was a pause in intervention. If Nurse Vance hadn't stepped in, that's a hypothetical. It's not, though. It's documented. The monitors show the pressure drop. Dr. Marsh. Sproat's voice was the voice of a man who was being patient at some cost to himself. I understand the impulse to defend a colleague. I want you to think about what precedent we'd be setting if clinical outcomes were the only standard we applied to protocol compliance. Marco, the scrub tech, was sitting at the back. He didn't raise his hand. He looked at the table. Holt was not at the meeting. He'd been scheduled to present and had sent a 2-word message to the department administrator, prior commitment, which was noticed, interpreted, and discussed in the parking lot afterward in ways he'd been aware would happen and hadn't cared enough about to prevent. When Sproat finished, the room dispersed with the specific discomfort of people who'd been told something they didn't believe in terms they couldn't argue with. Nora spent her suspension days the way she spent most of her time, moving through the world without particular urgency, doing things that needed doing. She ran in the mornings. She returned library books and checked out new ones. She regrouted the tile around her bathroom sink, which had needed it since winter. She did not make calls she couldn't justify making, and she did not contact anyone at the hospital. On the 4th day, someone contacted her. The message came through a routing she hadn't used in years, a secondary email address she'd maintained not from any specific expectation, but from the same instinct that made her check exits when she entered rooms and keep a go bag in the back of her car. The message was short, a name she recognized, a time, a coffee shop on the north end of town. She went. The woman waiting for her was named Iris Delacroix. She was 44, wore civilian clothes that had the same careful ordinariness as the clothes Nora herself favored, and ordered black coffee that she didn't touch. I'm not here officially, Iris said. Understood. There are people who've been watching the Kendall Peak situation, the OR incident, the complaint, the suspension. She turned her cup on the table. It's accelerating a timeline that was already in motion. What timeline? There's been an effort underway for about 2 years to reopen certain personnel files from the Kessler operation. She paused. You know which ones? Nora said nothing. The review board found procedural irregularities in how the disciplinary action was handled. That's not me editorializing. That's their language. Procedural irregularities. What it means in plain terms is that the process used to remove you from service didn't follow its own rules. That's old, Nora said. That's 3 years old. The finding is recent. The irregularities were old. Those aren't the same thing. Iris finally picked up her coffee, didn't drink it, set it down. The general's visit wasn't accidental. He wanted you to know that there are people positioned to move on this, but something happening at the hospital right now. The complaint, the suspension, it's visible in ways that are useful. Or could be. Nora looked at her. You want to use it. I want to make sure you understand that what's happening to you right now isn't happening in a vacuum. It never is. Iris met her eyes. There's going to be more pressure before this gets better. Sproat isn't finished. He's got the ear of at least 2 board members, and he's been building a case that your credentials are fundamentally misrepresented. If the credentialing audit goes the direction he's steering it, they'll terminate you and file a professional conduct report that follows you. I know how it works. Then you know that once that report is filed, it doesn't matter what comes after. The record exists. Iris paused. There are people who can intervene, but the timing has to be right. What does the timing require? Patience, Iris said, which I know isn't your strong suit. Nora almost smiled. You don't know me. I know the file. Iris stood up. Don't do anything visible. Don't push back in ways that give him material. Just stay in your lane and let the process work. And if the process fails, Iris picked up her bag. Then it doesn't. She left. Nora sat with the untouched coffee for another 10 minutes, watching the street through the window. A woman walked by with a stroller. A delivery driver jogged from a van to a doorway and back. An ordinary Tuesday morning in a city that didn't know her name. She thought about patience. She'd been patient for 3 years. She understood in the abstract that the geometry of patience required accepting that things moved on timelines that weren't yours. She'd accepted it. She was accepting it right now. It didn't make the waiting easier. It never had. The credentialing audit results came back on a Thursday, and they were not what Sproat had been expecting. What he'd expected, what he'd structured his complaint to produce, was a clean finding. Misrepresented qualifications, scope of practice violation, grounds for termination. What the audit produced instead was a wall. Not exoneration, not condemnation, just a wall. Nora's credentials cleared every standard verification check. Her licensure was valid. Her documented experience was accurate. The community college program was real. Her previous employers confirmed her employment history. There was simply nothing there to pull. He called the HR director. There has to be something, he said. We ran a full secondary review. Her file is clean. Her file is clean because something is missing from it. Those skill sets don't come from the training she has documented. Dr. Sproat, someone helped her build a record that passes surface review. That's what a clean file on someone with those skills tells you. A pause. I'm not sure I can act on that interpretation. Get an outside auditor, he said. Private credentialing firm. Independent review. Another pause, longer. That's a significant escalation. Yes, he said. It is. He hung up. Dana Marsh found out about the independent auditor request through a circuitous path that involved a scheduling coordinator, a shared printer, and a document that shouldn't have been left face up in the output tray. She stood in the copy room for a moment, reading it, and then she folded it carefully and took it to Holt's office. Holt read it without expression. Where did you get this? It was in the printer. He looked at her. She looked back. He didn't ask the follow-up question. He's not going to find anything, Dana said. Right? If her file is clean, a sufficiently motivated private firm can find inconsistencies in almost any file, Holt said, especially when the person commissioning the review tells them where to look. Can he do that? He's doing it. Dana sat in the chair across from his desk, which she'd never done before in the 6 months she'd been his fellow. It felt strange. Everything about the last 2 weeks felt strange, like she'd stepped slightly out of the timeline she'd been living in. Why does he care this much? The patient survived. It's over. Holt was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the document. Because she made him unnecessary, he said, in front of his team, in a field he's been working in for 20 years. He set the paper down. Some people can absorb that. Sproat isn't one of them. Dana thought about this. What do we do? We don't do anything. You go back to work. And you? He picked up his phone. I make a call. Nora heard about the independent auditor through Paul, who texted her in 3 words, "It's getting worse," and followed it with a longer message that laid out what he knew, which was incomplete but enough. She read it standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee going cold on the counter. She thought about what Iris had said. Don't do anything visible. Stay in your lane. She thought about patience and geometry and timelines. Then she put her phone face down on the counter, finished making her coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and spent 20 minutes writing down every interaction she'd documented in her own personal notes over 3 years at Kendall Peak. The dates, the specifics, the names. Not for any immediate purpose. Just to have it. Just to know it existed, somewhere outside her own head, in her own handwriting, with her own signature at the bottom. When she was done, she folded the pages into an envelope and put it in the lockbox under her bed next to 3 other items. A USB drive, a laminated card with a phone number she'd memorized 3 years ago and written down only because the memorization alone wasn't enough anymore, and a photograph. She did not look at the photograph. She closed the lockbox. She got dressed. She went for her run. The thing that broke the surface tension of the whole situation was not the audit and not the complaint and not any of the maneuvering that Sproat was conducting from his department chair's office 2 floors above the surgical wards. It was a fuel tanker. At 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, a tanker truck carrying industrial-grade petroleum distillate lost brake pressure on the highway overpass at the edge of the Sutter Falls warehouse district and struck a structural support column at speed. The resulting explosion was visible from the hospital's upper floors. The fire that followed was contained within 40 minutes by Sutter Falls Fire and the county hazmat team, which was the good news. The bad news was the 230 yards of road that had been occupied by vehicles when the overpass partially collapsed, passenger cars, a transit bus, and a construction crew on the bridge deck below. The first ambulance reached Kendall Peak's emergency department at 12:09. By 12:45, there were 11 critical patients in the department and 6 more incoming. The ER had gone to full diversion, which meant nothing because they were the only level 2 trauma facility within 40 miles, and diversion didn't change the math of distance. Nora was on Decker Street when the first alert went out. Not to her, she was suspended. She wasn't on any active call list, but she heard the sirens from her kitchen window, 3 of them overlapping, going toward the hospital rather than away from it, which told her something. She turned on her phone's emergency alert service and read the mass casualty notification that went out at 12:51. She stood at her window for a moment. Then she got her jacket and her keys and drove to Kendall Peak. She didn't call ahead. There was no good way to call ahead for this. The ER entrance was controlled chaos by the time she arrived. 2 ambulances offloading simultaneously, a fire department liaison running toward the main desk, family members who'd followed the ambulances being redirected by a single overwhelmed security officer. Nora walked through the entrance the way she walked through every entrance, without rushing, without hesitating, without drawing attention, straight to the supply station where she knew the triage supplies were kept, and started pulling. Gloria was running triage. She saw Nora and stopped for half a second. "You're suspended." "I know." "You can't—" "How many criticals?" Gloria looked at her. She was a careful woman, rule-following, 20 years of floor nursing, and she was standing in the middle of a hallway with 3 people on gurneys and 2 more coming through the door, and a critical shortage of anyone who knew what they were doing. 13 confirmed, 4 more incoming, 2 in active arrest. "Who's running the secondary triage area?" "There is no secondary. We haven't set one up. We don't have Conference Room B," Nora said. It's 40 feet from the loading bay. Get me 2 nurses and tell them to bring the field triage kits from the supply closet at the end of the south hall, the ones in the orange cases. Those are for... I know what they're for. Go. Gloria went. Nora moved. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of organized improvisation that looked, from the outside, like instinct, and was in fact the result of a very specific kind of training applied to a very specific kind of crisis. She set up secondary triage in conference room B. She directed the 2 nurses Gloria sent. One of them was Danny Cho, who arrived with a face that cycled through 8 different expressions in 10 seconds and then settled into focused. And she worked the incoming patients with the same economy of motion she'd shown in OR3, only multiplied across a space that was nothing like a surgical theater and everything like the field environment she'd spent years in before Sutter Falls, and community college programs and medication reconciliation audits. She did not stop moving. She did not raise her voice. When a physician arrived in conference room B 20 minutes in, Dr. Osmond, the resident who'd been pulled from an upper floor when the department ran out of available attendings, he stood in the doorway for a moment and took in the organized chaos of the room. The 3 critical patients being worked simultaneously, the triage tags moving with logic, the 2 nurses anticipating needs without being told, Nora at the center of it like a fixed point. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Second table needs a chest needle. Left tension pneumo. You can hear it." He came in. He listened. He went to the second table. He could hear it. At 1:34 p.m., the first military vehicles arrived in the hospital parking lot. Not ambulances. Not emergency services. 3 vehicles, dark, civilian enough to be parked without attracting immediate attention from anyone who wasn't looking for them, and 2 of them were. Nora was looking for them, or would have been, if she'd had a hand free, which she didn't because she was maintaining an airway on a 40-year-old construction worker whose neck had taken glass from the bridge explosion and whose O2 sat had been climbing for the last 4 minutes in a direction that said the intervention was working. She knew the vehicles were there because Osmond said, "There are some people at the ER entrance asking about the triage situation," and his voice had the note it gets when something is off the map of his experience. "What kind of people?" she said without looking up. "Military, I think. Civilian clothes, but..." "Tell them I'm in B," she said. "Tell them I'll be out when I'm done." He went. He came back 3 minutes later. They said they'll wait. Good. The construction worker's O2 sat hit 92. Nora released a breath she hadn't been aware of holding and passed the airway management to Danny, who had, in the last 40 minutes, done 3 things she'd never done before and done all of them correctly. "You're good," Nora told her. Danny nodded. Her face was still cycling, but slower now. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." Nora stripped her gloves and walked to the door. The corridor outside conference room B had the wrung-out quality of a space that had been at maximum intensity for too long. Supply wrappers on the floor, 2 empty gurneys pushed against the wall, a nursing aide sitting on the floor with her back to the wall and her eyes closed, not injured, just done. At the far end of the corridor near the emergency exit, 2 men in civilian clothes were standing with the specific posture of people who are very accustomed to waiting and are waiting right now under conditions that are testing that accustomedness. Behind them, just visible through the emergency exit's narrow window, was a 3rd vehicle she hadn't seen from the parking lot angle. Not civilian. Military plates. And leaning against the wall beside the exit, in the hospital corridor, still in his cardiac monitoring bracelet from the 4th floor, was General Harold Weston. He looked at her. "Vance," he said, "we need to talk, and before you tell me it can wait." He glanced at the corridor around them, the aftermath of the last hour still visible in every direction. "It can't." She almost told him no, not because she didn't understand the urgency. She could read a situation the way other people read words on a page, fast and without effort, and what she was reading right now was serious. But there were still 2 critical patients in conference room B. Danny was managing an airway she'd never managed before, and Osmond was running a chest decompression on 17 hours of residency sleep. The impulse to stay was not sentimental. It was procedural. You didn't leave a field until the field was stable. 2 minutes, she told Weston. She went back into conference room B. Danny looked up. "The neck injury is stable," Nora said. Watch his sat. If it drops below 90, you know what to do. Osmond's chest is handled. The woman on table 3 needs a pressure recheck every 8 minutes until the surgical team gets here. Do you have that? I have it, Danny said. Her voice had changed in the last 40 minutes. Something had settled into it. You're running this until the attending gets down here. Okay. Not okay, maybe. Okay. Okay, Danny said, and meant it. Nora went back to the corridor. Weston had moved away from the exit, which told her the 2 men in civilian clothes had said something to him. He was standing near the wall with his arms crossed, the monitoring bracelet still on his wrist, looking like a man who had been in worse places and was managing his impatience through sheer accumulated practice. You walked out of a cardiac unit, Nora said. I was discharged this morning. You're still in the bracelet. He looked at his wrist. Administrative oversight. He didn't touch it. Vance, there's a team here from the Office of the Inspector General. They arrived this morning before the tanker. The timing is, it's not related to the emergency, but it's not separate from it anymore either. What do they want? They want the hospital's emergency response documentation for the last 18 months. They want personnel files for the surgical department, and he paused. They want to interview you. She looked at him. Me specifically. You specifically. The OR3 incident triggered a flag in a system that was already monitoring Kendall Peak for unrelated reasons. He glanced down the corridor. The 2 men were far enough away to be out of earshot, close enough to remind her they existed. Sproat has been filing reports with the State Medical Board in addition to the internal complaint. Some of what he filed included language about credential misrepresentation that overlapped with a separate IG investigation into a different matter at this facility. What separate matter? Weston was quiet for a moment. There are billing irregularities in the surgical department going back 4 years. Significant ones. The kind that suggest resources being diverted and documentation being altered. He looked at her. Sproat is at the center of it. He's been the one managing the alteration. The corridor was noisy at the far end. Another gurney coming through, radios, someone calling for an available nurse, and here, at the close end, very quiet. He filed against me, Nora said, because I was getting looked at. He filed against you to create noise, to make the IG's attention land somewhere other than where it was pointing. Weston uncrossed his arms. It didn't work, but it brought them here faster, and now, he gestured, a small movement that encompassed the hospital, the mass casualty situation, the general state of things. Now everything is happening at once. Nora looked at the emergency exit window. The military vehicle was still there. Why is that vehicle here? She said. Weston didn't answer immediately. General, your record is being reviewed, he said. The personnel file from Kessler. The official one, not your reconstructed civilian documentation. There's a team that's been building the case for reinstatement, and one of the components, one of the things they needed, was evidence that the disciplinary action taken against you was retaliatory rather than procedural. He paused. The IG investigation into Sproat is separate, but the pattern of what he did to you here, the complaint, the suspension, the attempt to manufacture credentialing fraud, that pattern is going to be part of the record. It's circumstantial. It's consistent. He said it with the conviction of a man who had spent 40 years reading evidence and knew what consistent patterns built. The vehicle is here because the people who've been working on your case wanted to be present when the IG interviewed you, not to intervene, to document. Nora was quiet. You should have told me, she said. In the hospital room, you should have said all of this. You would have left Sutter Falls. She didn't deny it. I know, he said. That's why I didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd known in a different life, in a different version of herself, who had been present for some of the worst days she'd had and some of the ones she was most glad had happened, and who was standing in a hospital corridor in a cardiac monitoring bracelet, making the case that the world she'd left was not finished with her. I need to get back to my patients, she said. The IG team is setting up in the administrator's conference room. They'll want you in an hour. I'll be there when I'm ready, she said. Tell them to order coffee. It's going to take more than an hour. She went back through the door. The next 40 minutes were the kind that existed in a category outside normal time, dense and specific, each minute containing more than a minute should. 3 more patients came through the loading bay. One of them, a woman in her 50s, had blast fragmentation in both forearms that looked worse than it was, and a head injury that looked better than it was. And Nora caught the discrepancy in the patient's pupil response during the initial assessment and redirected her to imaging before the surgical team could clear her for a lower acuity slot. Osmond watched this happen from across the room. "How did you see that?" he said. "I was looking at the arms." "The arms weren't going to kill her in the next hour," Nora said. "The head might." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a battle sign assessment." "Yes." "That's trauma surgery protocol." "Yes." He looked at her. He was very tired, the specific tiredness of a person running past their reserves on something that feels too important to stop for. "Who are you?" he said. Not the way Holt had said it, as dismissal, as a real question. She was already moving to the next patient. "Do your chart," she said. "The imaging team is going to need your notes on the head injury before they'll prioritize her." He did his chart. Buzzshot. By the time the surgical attending arrived in conference room B, a Dr. Yolanda Price, who had the look of someone who had run from another floor and was still running internally, the room had achieved a state that was not calm but was controlled, which was the relevant distinction. Price stood in the doorway and did what Osmond had done, which was assess the situation before entering it, and what she saw made her stop for a full 3 seconds. 3 patients stable, triage tags correctly assigned, documentation current. 2 nurses working with the quiet efficiency of people who had been given clear direction and had followed it. 1 resident charting with the focused intensity of someone who understood what he was documenting. And at the far end of the room, a woman in a Kendall Peak jacket she had no current authorization to wear, finishing a patient assessment with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done this. Not this exactly, not conference room B triage, but this, the thing underneath it. More times than could be counted. "You're Vance," Price said. Nora finished writing. "Yes." "You're suspended." "I know." Price looked around the room again. At the patients. At the tags. At Osmond's charting, which she scanned briefly and which was good. Better than it usually was, with the kind of specificity that came from being supervised by someone who knew what mattered. "The woman in slot 2 has a head imaging order. Bilateral pupil asymmetry on admission," Nora said. 2 millimeter difference. She presented with forearm fragmentation, which was the focus of the initial assessment. Price walked to slot 2. She looked at the patient. She looked at the chart. She took her own pen light out and checked the pupils. Then she set the light down and turned around. "You caught that?" "Yes." Price had been practicing emergency medicine for 16 years and had her own catalog of moments she kept in the part of her mind that was not strictly clinical, the ones that stayed with her not because they were dramatic but because they were definitive. This was going in there. "I'll take over from here," she said. "You—" She stopped. Made a decision that was visible crossing her face. "You should know the hospital administrator is looking for you." "I have a meeting with the IG team." "Yes," Price said, "and the administrator, and I'm told someone from the surgical board. They're all in the 4th floor conference room." She paused. "Sprode is up there too." Nora picked up her clipboard. She looked at Danny. "You did well." Danny Cho, who had spent 2 years being the person who said that Nora was weird, who had asked questions at breaks that were more suspicious than curious, who had been in that room for the last 90 minutes doing things she hadn't known she was capable of, said, "I just followed your lead." "I know," Nora said. "That's what doing well looks like." She left conference room B. The 4th floor conference room had the feel of a space that had been arranged to communicate something specific about who was in charge. Lena Ferris sat at the head of the table, which was appropriate given her title, but the quality of her posture was not that of someone comfortable in that position this afternoon. To her left, 2 people in professional attire with IG credentials visible on lanyards. To her right, a woman Nora didn't recognize who had the efficient appearance of someone from the state medical board. And at the far side of the table, Dr. Randall Sproat, whose expression when Nora walked in cycled through several things very quickly before settling on controlled. Weston was not in the room. His people weren't either. That was deliberate, Nora understood. They were documentation, not intervention. She sat down without being asked to. The senior IG investigator, a compact woman in her 40s named Adrienne Lowe, who had the particular quality of stillness that came from a career of listening to people say things that weren't true and knowing it, opened a folder. "Ms. Vance," Lowe said, "thank you for coming up." "I was asked to." "Yes." Lowe looked at the folder. "I want to be clear about the scope of this conversation. We're conducting an investigation into administrative and billing practices in this facility's surgical department over the last 4 years. Your name has come up in the context of that investigation, but not as a subject of inquiry." She paused. "You are, as far as this office is concerned, a witness." Sproat shifted in his chair. "I want to understand something about the complaint filed against you," Lowe continued, "specifically the timing, the credential investigation Dr. Sproat initiated, the secondary review, the private auditor request. Walk me through your understanding of that sequence." "I performed an emergency intervention in an active surgical case," Nora said. "The patient survived. 2 days later, a complaint was filed. The following week, an independent credentialing review was requested." "And your credentials were clean?" "They were." "The private auditor found no irregularities?" "Correct." Lowe made a note. "Dr. Sproat." She didn't look up. "You've maintained that the concern driving your complaint was scope of practice, not personal grievance." "That's correct," Sproat said. "Then help me understand the billing code alterations in surgical department documentation going back to," she turned a page, "March of 2021. The room's quality changed. It was subtle, not dramatic, nothing like the movies, just a slight shift in the air pressure, the way a room changes when someone opens a window somewhere you can't see. Sproat's voice stayed level. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. I have 47 documents," Lowe said, "altered post-authorization. The alterations route approximately $11,000 per quarter into a discretionary administrative account that has no direct departmental approval chain." She finally looked up. "The account was opened under a departmental initiative that was approved in your name. That account is for equipment contingencies. There are no equipment expenditures logged against it in the last 22 months. Lowe's voice had not changed in pitch or speed. What there are is a series of transfers to a consulting firm that, when we traced it, does not appear to have provided any consulting services to this hospital." Ferris was very still at the head of the table. The woman from the medical board was writing. Sproat looked at Nora. It was involuntary, she thought. The way people look toward the thing they blame when they're cornered, even when the thing they're blaming is not the thing that cornered them. She met his gaze. She held it. She said nothing. "I'm going to need to speak with counsel," Sproat said. "That's your right," Lowe said. "We'll pause this portion of the conversation." She closed the folder. "Ms. Vance, I have some additional questions about events in the surgical department, specifically about the documentation you may have observed during your time in the facility." She paused. "I'd also like to discuss some information that came to us through a separate channel, regarding your prior service record and the circumstances of your separation from military medical service." The room was very quiet. Nora looked at Lowe. She looked at the closed folder, which was thick enough to hold more than billing documents. She thought about the general in the corridor below, about Iris Delacroix and her untouched coffee, about a phone call that had lasted 4 minutes and set something moving that was now very visibly in motion. "How much do you have?" she said. Lowe met her eyes. "Enough to start." And at that moment, before Nora could respond, the door to the conference room opened. Not knocked, opened. One of Weston's people, the attendant from the hospital room, who had the look of someone delivering information he'd been told to deliver the moment it arrived. "General Weston needs 2 minutes," he said. "Now, it's about the Kessler file." Every person at the table looked at Nora. She stood up. "I'll be right back," she said to Lowe. In the corridor, Weston's attendant handed her a phone. On the screen was a single document, a scanned page, official letterhead, dense text that she recognized immediately because she'd read the original version of it years ago in a very different room, in a very different state of mind. It was a classified after-action report from the Kessler operation. But this version had a section she had never seen. Redacted in the copy she'd been shown at the time, unredacted in this one, and what it said in 6 lines of dry official language was that the order she had disobeyed, the order that had ended her career, had itself been issued in violation of standing medical evacuation protocol. That the commanding officer who issued it had known that there were 3 witnesses whose statements had been suppressed in the original disciplinary review. Her hands did not shake. She read it twice. She gave the phone back. "When was this declassified?" she said. "This morning," the attendant said. "The general thought you should see it before you went back in there." She stood in the corridor for exactly 5 seconds. Then she straightened, turned back to the conference room door, and put her hand on the handle. Inside that room, behind that door, was a table full of people who had spent the last 2 weeks deciding what she was. An investigator who was unraveling the man who'd tried to erase her, a fraud case that was about to become very public, and a file, finally unredacted, that said what she'd known for 3 years and been unable to prove. She opened the door. She sat back down. Lowe looked at her. Something in the investigator's face had shifted. Not dramatically, not warmly, just a degree of attention that hadn't quite been there before. A recalibration so small it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't practiced at reading rooms. "You've seen something," Lowe said. "Yes." "Is it relevant to this conversation?" "It's relevant to a lot of things." Nora folded her hands on the table. Her voice was the same it always was, which was itself a kind of answer. "I'd like to table the discussion about my service record for a moment and return to the billing question. Specifically, do you have the full authorization chain for the discretionary account, not just the transfers? The approval signatures." Lowe opened the folder again. "We have 3 of the 4 required signatures." "Who's missing?" "The department co-chair sign-off. That position was held by..." Lowe turned a page. "Dr. Harlan Ogle, retired 14 months ago." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Ogle didn't retire," she said. "He was pushed out. There was a disagreement about resource allocation in the surgical department. I heard about it during my first year here, from staff who'd been around for the transition. He and Sproat had a significant conflict and Ogle left within 6 weeks of it." Ferris looked up. "I wasn't in administration," Nora said before Ferris could speak. "I was in surgical prep. But in hospitals, people talk. Especially when a well-regarded department co-chair leaves suddenly." She looked at Lowe. "If Ogle refused to sign off on the account, there should be a record of why. And if that record was removed, it would explain the gap in the authorization chain," Lowe said. "Yes." Lowe wrote something. She did it without apparent urgency, which was its own form of urgency. Across the table, Sproat's posture had changed. It was subtle. Nothing as obvious as slumping or stiffening, just a slight shift in how his weight was distributed, the way a building shifts before anyone hears the crack. He was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table for the last 6 minutes. "I'll be locating Dr. Ogle," Lowe said. "This afternoon." She looked at Nora. "Now, your service record. The document you have, Joe. Is it the summary or the full file?" "Summary, as of this morning. We've requested the full classification review." "There's a section in the full file that was redacted in the version used in my disciplinary proceedings," Nora said. "I've just been shown an unredacted copy. It pertains to the order I disobeyed during the Kessler operation." She paused. The order was itself issued in violation of standing medical evacuation protocol. The commanding officer who issued it was aware of this. There were witnesses. The room was very quiet. "Their statements were suppressed," Nora said, "in the original disciplinary review." Ferris had stopped pretending to take notes. She was looking at Nora with the expression of someone revising a significant number of things simultaneously. The woman from the medical board. She'd introduced herself earlier as Dr. Prisha Nalini, and she had the specific quality of a person who had walked into one meeting and discovered it was actually 3. Set down her pen. "Ms. Vance," Nalini said carefully, "are you saying that the disciplinary action that ended your military medical career was based on a proceeding in which exculpatory witness testimony was deliberately withheld?" "Yes."
And you have documentation of this. I have a scanned copy of the unredacted section.
The original is being processed through the declassification review that was completed this morning. Nalini looked at Lo. Something passed between them that was professional and brief and said several things without words. I think, Lo said, we're going to need a larger room. They moved to the administrator's suite on the 5th floor, which had a conference table that seated 14 and a window that looked out over the parking lot where Weston's vehicles were still parked. Nora could see them from where she sat, which was not an accident. She'd chosen the seat deliberately, the same way she chose most things. Additional people arrived. An IG attorney, Lo, called in from a staging location Nora hadn't known about. A representative from the hospital's legal counsel who arrived, looking harassed, and became progressively more so as the afternoon continued. And at Lo's specific request, Dr. Harlan Ogle, who turned out to live 40 minutes outside Sutter Falls, and had driven to the hospital with the particular energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this phone call for 14 months. Ogle was 67, compact, with the direct manner of someone who had spent decades in surgical medicine and had run out of patience for indirection somewhere around his 55th year. He sat down across from Sproat and looked at him with an expression that was not hostile. It was something quieter than hostility, and therefore more definitive. "Harlan," Sproat said. "Randall," Ogle said. That was all they said to each other for the next 2 hours. Ogle confirmed what Nora had said about the disagreement, but he gave it specifics. He had refused to co-sign the discretionary account authorization because Sproat had not been able to produce documentation of the equipment contingency purpose the account was supposedly created for. He had asked for the documentation 3 times over the course of 2 months. Each time, Sproat had provided reasons for delay that were plausible and accumulated in a way that became implausible. When Ogle finally refused outright and indicated he intended to flag the account to the compliance office, Sproat had initiated a performance review process against him that Ogle's attorney had characterized as retaliatory. "I took early retirement instead of fighting it," Ogle said. "I had 32 years in this department. I was tired. I made a calculation." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I shouldn't have." Lo's attorney was making a recording. The legal counsel for the hospital was on her second phone call to a number Nora suspected was the board chair. "The compliance flag," Lo said. "Did you file it?" "I started to. I have the draft." He had brought a folder, physical, paper, the kind of thing you kept in a home filing cabinet and hadn't looked at in months but knew exactly where it was. He put it on the table. "I stopped before submitting because my attorney advised me that without the co-signature issue resolved, the flag could be characterized as a grievance rather than a compliance report, that I would be the one investigated, not the account." "And you believed that?" "I believed it was possible," Ogle said. "I'd watched Sproat operate for 8 years. He was very good at making challenges to his authority look like the challenger's problem." Nora thought of a suspended nurse eating lunch in a break room that smelled like machine oil, answering a surgeon's questions about training she couldn't document. She thought about a 7-word complaint filed 3 weeks after an OR incident that had saved a man's life. Some patterns were efficient precisely because they worked everywhere they were applied. At 4:17, Lo's team produced a second set of documents. These from a federal financial monitoring system that had flagged the consulting firm receiving transfers from Sproat's discretionary account. The firm had a registered address in a state Sproat had no documented connection to, 2 employees listed on its business registration, and revenue history that showed no activity in the 18 months before the Kendall Peak transfers began. One of the 2 registered employees shared a last name with Sproat's brother-in-law. The legal counsel for the hospital stopped making phone calls and started making a different kind of call. Sproat's attorney arrived at 4:45 and immediately requested a recess, which Lo granted for 30 minutes. During the recess, Nora stood at the window and watched a car pull into the parking lot below. Civilian, Oregon plates, a woman behind the wheel who sat for a moment before getting out. She was in her mid-30s, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd driven a distance and hadn't stopped to eat. Nora recognized her. Iris Delacroix. She didn't come upstairs. She walked to Weston's vehicle instead, and Nora watched the 2 of them talk in the parking lot through the glass. Iris with her arms crossed, Weston nodding at intervals, the conversation short. Then Iris looked up at the building, and for a moment Nora thought she was going to look directly at the window, but she didn't. She looked 2 floors lower, at the emergency department entrance, where the last of the afternoon's mass casualty patients was still being processed. Then she went back to her car and made a call. Whatever was moving, it was moving faster now. Shut. When the recess ended, Sproat's attorney opened with a prepared statement about the voluntary nature of his client's cooperation, which Lowe received without expression and noted for the record. Then she returned to the documents, and Sproat's attorney began the specific work of trying to create distance between his client and things his client had signed. It was a procedure Nora had seen in a different context, not legal, but structural. The way a person under pressure tries to redistribute weight, to make each individual piece look manageable while the aggregate collapses. She watched it with the same attention she gave to everything and said nothing, because she didn't need to say anything. Lowe had the documents. Ogle had the folder. The financial monitoring system had the transfer records. At 5:20, Nalini from the medical board asked to speak privately with Lowe. They were gone for 11 minutes. When they returned, Nalini sat down and looked at Ferris. The hospital board needs to be notified today, Nalini said. This afternoon. There are patient safety implications in the billing irregularities that require immediate disclosure. Ferris had known this was coming. She showed it only in the way she picked up her phone. Deliberately, without hurry, the control of a person who has accepted an outcome and is now managing its execution. I'll call the board chair. I'll need to be in that call. Of course. Sproat looked at the table. His attorney put a hand on his arm and said something quietly. Sproat shook his head slightly. Not a disagreement, just the automatic refusal of a man who hadn't yet adjusted to the new geography of his situation, who was still operating on the instinct that there was a move left to make. There wasn't. Nora could see this clearly. She'd seen it before, the specific moment when the space for maneuvering closed and the person inside it hadn't accepted it yet. It was never dramatic. It was always slightly sad, even when the person had done something that deserved the closing. She looked away from him. Oh. At 6:03, Lowe returned to the question of Nora's service record. By this point, the room had thinned. Sproat and his attorney had been moved to a separate space pending further questioning. The hospital legal counsel was managing 3 simultaneous crises from the corner, and the people remaining at the main table were Lowe, her attorney, Nalini, Ferris, and Nora. The unredacted section you described, Lowe said, the witness statements. Can you tell me who the witnesses were? 2 were medical personnel who were present during the evacuation. 1 was an intelligence officer who was observing the operation for separate reasons. Nora paused. All 3 gave statements that the order issued by the commanding officer was verbal, undocumented, and contradicted the written evacuation protocol for that theater. The statements were collected as part of the initial inquiry. They were not included in the documentation presented at my disciplinary hearing. Were you aware they existed at the time of the hearing? No. When did you find out? About 4 months after my separation. One of the medical personnel, the one I was closest to, contacted me through a channel I'd set up for that kind of communication. She told me what she'd said in her statement and that she'd been told it wouldn't be included. On what grounds? Classified operational security, which was the reason given for a significant amount of what happened around that hearing. Nora's voice was even. The order I disobeyed was given in a context that my commanding officer preferred not to have examined too closely. The disciplinary action against me was, she chose the next word carefully, convenient. Lowe made a note. The soldier you treated during the evacuation. Yes. Can you tell me what happened? Nora had told this story before, not many times, and never willingly. She told it now the way she did everything, without decoration, without self-pity, with the flat precision of a person recounting events rather than experiencing them again. She had been the senior medical officer on an extraction team during an evacuation under fire. The standing order was to move all personnel to the extraction point and hold for airlift. A soldier had been separated from the main group during the initial contact and was critically injured. Abdominal wound, arterial compromise. 6 minutes from the point of no return by her assessment. The commanding officer's order was to proceed to extraction without deviation. She had deviated. She had gone back for him. She had stabilized him in a drainage ditch 40 meters from the extraction point with a modified tourniquet technique and a field repair she'd worked out under fire, and she had carried him to the extraction point in time for the airlift. He had survived. She had been the last person onto the helicopter. The commanding officer filed the disciplinary report within 48 hours of return, she said. His stated grounds were insubordination and endangerment of the extraction team. The actual grounds, she stopped. The actual grounds were that he had issued an order he knew was wrong, and I had made that visible. The room was quiet. Nalini was looking at her with an expression that had moved outside the professional register. There's a record, Nora said. Not just the witnesses. There are medical records from the evacuation debrief. The soldiers' injuries, the treatment provided, the timeline. Those records support my account of what happened. They were not suppressed. They simply weren't presented in a way that made the sequence clear. She paused. The unredacted section of the after-action report makes the sequence clear. Lowe looked at her attorney. The attorney nodded once. Ms. Vance, Lowe said, the review board that examined your case, the Military Personnel Review Board, will need to be notified of the declassification. That's a separate process from what we're doing here today. But the IG's office has standing to file a formal referral requesting expedited review, given the nature of the suppressed testimony. I'm aware of that process, Nora said. Is that something you'd want us to initiate? She'd been thinking about this for 3 years, not always in words, sometimes in the abstract shape of it. The question of whether the thing that had been taken from her was something she wanted back, or something she'd already grieved past the point of return. She'd told herself it was the latter. She'd built a life on the assumption of the latter. But the unredacted document had said in 6 lines what she'd known and been unable to prove, and something about seeing it in writing, official, stamped, attributed, had shifted the ground under the assumption. Yes, she said. Initiate it. Lowe made the note. We'll move quickly. Given the age of the case and the circumstances of the suppression, there's a strong argument for expedited classification. Ferris had been listening. She'd been listening to all of it, and she was a methodical woman, and she was visibly resorting things that she had previously sorted incorrectly. Ms. Vance, she said, I need to... She stopped, started again. The administrative suspension will be lifted, effective immediately. That's within my authority, and I'm doing it. Thank you, Nora said. The complaint Sproat filed, the formal record, I'll initiate the correction process. Okay. Ferris looked at her for a moment. There was something in her face that wasn't quite apology. It was more complex than that, the expression of a person who had made defensible decisions that were nevertheless wrong, and who knew it. I read your file, she said, when this started. I read it, and it was clean, and I still went with the administrative process. You did your job, Nora said. You followed procedure. The procedure was being used as a weapon. I know. I should have... Dr. Ferris. Nora's voice was not harsh. It was simply direct. You didn't know what I was. You didn't know what he was doing. You made decisions based on the information you had. She paused. That's all any of us can do. Ferris nodded. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't meant to be. But it was acknowledgement, which was what it was. Passed. At 7:45 that evening, Sproat was formally notified by the IG's office that he was under active federal financial investigation. His attorney issued a statement of non-cooperation. The hospital's legal counsel, in a conversation with the board chair that lasted 22 minutes, conveyed the essential facts of the billing irregularities and their scope and the significant likelihood that patient care resources had been systematically redirected over a period of 4 years. The board chair asked 2 questions. The first was, how bad? The answer was, bad. The second was, what do we need to do right now? The answer to that was longer. By 8:30, the board had convened an emergency session via video conference. Sproat's administrative privileges were suspended pending the investigation, not his clinical license, which was outside the board's authority, but his department chair role, his committee memberships, his signatory authority on any hospital document. The suspension was effective immediately and would be made part of the public record as required under the facility's disclosure obligations. Dana Marsh heard about it from Marco, who heard about it from one of the OR schedulers. And she sat in the break room on the third floor for a moment with a cold cup of coffee and thought about a step backward she'd taken on a night 3 weeks ago, and what it had cost her to take it, and what it had cost other people. She sent Nora a text. "I'm glad you were there. That night. I should have said it before." She didn't know if Nora would respond. She sent it anyway. But Nora was in the parking lot when the text arrived. She read it, put the phone in her pocket, and stood for a moment looking at the hospital's main entrance. The lights on inside, the movement visible through the glass doors, the ordinary ongoing business of a place where people were injured and helped and sometimes not helped, and sometimes helped in ways nobody expected. Weston came up beside her. His people had pulled back and they were in the vehicle, giving them space, which was a consideration she appreciated. "The referral went up an hour ago," he said. "Expedited review. They're pulling the full file tonight." "I know. It's going to move quickly. When they see the suppressed testimony," he paused. "This isn't going to take years, Vance. The board isn't going to sit on it. We'll see. I've been in this process for 31 years. I know what it looks like when it's moving in one direction." He looked at the hospital. "The soldier. You should know that his family has been part of the push for this review. His father. He's been making the case to anyone who would listen for 2 years. She'd known this, in the abstract. The general had said something in the hospital room. She hadn't let herself think about it in specifics. "He has a name," she said. "The father is Bertram Lurie. He's—" Weston paused. "He's 81. He's been very persistent for an 81-year-old man." Nora looked at the sky. It was dark now, the mountains invisible, just the orange glow of the city reflecting off a low cloud layer. She thought about an 81-year-old man making phone calls and writing letters and showing up in offices to make a case for a woman he'd never met, about a debt he felt because his son was alive. People did strange things with gratitude, sometimes useful things. "I want to talk to him," she said. "That can be arranged." "Not yet. After the review." Weston nodded. "After the review." She put her hands in her jacket pockets. The parking lot was cold, the end of March still carrying winter at the edges. "What happens to Sproat?" "Federal financial investigation has its own timeline. Criminal referral is likely, given the structure of the consulting firm. His brother-in-law is already being looked at." Weston's voice was matter-of-fact. "His license goes to the medical board for the pattern of retaliatory conduct. The complaint against you, the Ogle situation, that's Nalini's process. It'll take longer, but it'll happen." "The billing. The money that went to the consulting firm, though, they'll try to recover it. Some of it, anyway. The hospital will have to deal with the patient care implications. There'll be a compliance audit. It's going to be a bad year for this facility administratively." "The patients are fine," Nora said. "The direct care wasn't compromised. The billing was the diversion. That'll matter to the investigation. It won't make the publicity easier." She knew. She didn't say anything. "There's one more thing," Weston said. She looked at him. "The mass casualty response today." He had the tone he used when he was being precise about something that mattered. "The triage system you set up in conference room B, the protocol you used for patient sorting, the documentation you had Osmond generate, the decision tree you ran for the head injury." He paused. "Price filed an internal commendation with the ER director before you came upstairs, and Osmond put in a written account for the department record. That's their prerogative. It's also going to be part of the personnel review when your suspension is formally lifted." He paused. "And it's on record for the reinstatement case. Demonstrating current clinical competence isn't just about old files." She looked at him. "You've been planning this for a while?" "The general tendency of events," he said without admitting or denying. "I've been watching for a while." She almost said something about that, about being watched, about what it cost to be the subject of someone else's long game, even when their intentions were good. But it wasn't the right moment, and she was tired in a way that went below the physical, and the cold was settling into her shoulders. "I'm going home," she said. "I'll be in contact tomorrow. The review board will want a formal statement. They'll send a request through official channels, but I wanted you to expect it." She nodded. "Vance."
He stopped her with her name rather than reaching for her arm, which was the right call. What you did today. The triage. Not the meeting. The actual work. She waited. That's what it always was, he said. Every day you spent here doing prep work and inventory and med reconciliation. That was never going to be the full picture. She looked at him for a moment. It was enough, she said, when it needed to be. She walked to her car. On Decker Street, she sat in the dark for a few minutes before going upstairs. Her phone had a message from Dana Marsh and one from Paul that said heard some things. You okay? And one from a number she didn't recognize that, when she opened it, turned out to be from Osman. He'd gotten her number from the hospital system, which was technically a privacy violation and practically a sign that he was going to be a good doctor. That just said the woman in slot 2 went to imaging and they caught it. She's in surgery now. She's going to be okay. She responded to Osman first. Good call on the charting. Do that every time. She put the phone away. She went upstairs. She unlocked the lockbox. She took out the envelope with the legal pad pages, the one she'd written the morning after Iris Delacroix and the coffee shop. She looked at it for a moment. Her own handwriting, 3 years of documented interactions, names and dates and specifics, and then she put it back. She might still need it. Probably not. But the habit of keeping records was one she'd learned too well to unlearn. She closed the lockbox. She sat at her kitchen table and did not make dinner. She looked at the window, which was dark, which reflected her own face back at her in the glass. The kitchen light, her jacket, the Kendall Peak ID badge she was still wearing because she'd forgotten to take it off. The institutional photo on it slightly blurry in the way hospital ID photos always were. Her phone rang. The number was one she recognized. The formal military administrative line, the kind of number that only called for official purposes, and only at times that were determined by schedules rather than consideration. It was 9:47 at night. She picked up. Ms. Vance, said the voice on the other end, measured, bureaucratic, careful with the title. This is the office of the Military Personnel Review Board. I'm calling to confirm receipt of the expedited referral submitted this evening regarding your case. A pause. We've completed the initial document review. That was fast, she said. The classification review was completed earlier today, and the documentation package was thorough. We do want to proceed quickly. Another pause. I need to inform you that in the course of the initial review, we've identified a secondary matter that we weren't previously aware of. The voice shifted. Not much, but enough. It pertains to the commanding officer who initiated the disciplinary action against you. His name is Colonel Reeves Tollin. A pause. Retired. I know his name, she said. Are you aware that Colonel Tollin filed a supplementary report with this office 14 months ago, after your separation, in which he provided additional characterization of your conduct during the Kessler operation? Nora went still. No, she said. I wasn't aware. The report was filed as a formal addendum to your separation documentation. It included characterizations that, the voice was being very careful, that went beyond the scope of the original disciplinary finding. What kind of characterizations? A pause. Ms. Vance, I'd prefer to discuss the specifics in a formal setting, but I want you to be aware before that meeting that the report exists, and that the witnesses whose testimony was suppressed from the original hearing, 2 of the 3 have submitted new statements in conjunction with the declassification review. And the third, she said, a longer pause. The third witness, the voice said carefully, submitted a statement as well. Her statement corroborates the others regarding the evacuation order. Another pause. She also corroborates something else, something that was not part of the original inquiry. A beat. Ms. Vance, are you in a position to come in tomorrow morning? She looked at her reflection in the dark window. What did she say? Nora said. I think it's better if... What did she say? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she counted it. 4 seconds. 5. She says that Colonel Tollin gave a second order, the voice said, after the evacuation, one that she witnessed personally. A pause. Regarding you specifically. She didn't sleep, not in the dramatic way of someone lying awake catastrophizing. She'd trained that particular response out of herself a long time ago,
in the early years when she'd had to learn to sleep in loud places, in cold places, in places where the ground moved. What she did instead was sit at the kitchen table with a glass of water she occasionally remembered to drink and think, which was its own kind of rest if you did it right. The second order, regarding her specifically. She turned it over the way you turn something over in the dark, when you can't see it clearly, testing the edges, the weight of it. She knew Tallinn. She'd known him for 4 years before the Kessler operation, worked 3 theaters under his command, understood his methods the way you understand someone you've observed under pressure. He was a man who managed risk by managing information, which meant he decided what existed and what didn't based on what was useful to him. The second order explained things she'd never fully explained to herself. The speed of the disciplinary process, the completeness of her erasure, not just separation, but the quality of it, the way doors that should have remained open had closed. People who'd known her, worked alongside her, who should have surfaced as character witnesses or professional references, and instead had gone quiet. She'd attributed that to the nature of the situation, to the particular loneliness of being on the wrong side of an institutional verdict. Now she was revising that attribution. At 2 a.m, she got up, went to the window, looked at the empty street. A cat crossed under the streetlight. A car passed going north, the only traffic she'd seen in an hour. Sutter Falls at 2 a.m. was the same city it was at 2 p.m. Just quieter. The infrastructure more visible without the people in front of it. She thought about Bertram Lurie, 81 years old, making his case in offices. She thought about a young woman in a drainage ditch who had been her a long time ago choosing. She went back to bed at 3 and slept until 5:30, which was enough. The Military Personnel Review Board operated out of a federal building in Portland, which was 2 hours from Sutter Falls on a clear morning, and the morning was clear. Nora drove it herself, declining the offer of transport that Weston's office had extended. She needed the drive, the 2 hours of road and mountain, and the particular quality of thinking that movement produced. The building was the kind that federal architecture produced in a specific era. Utilitarian, not unpleasant, built for function, and indifferent to impression. She went through the security process without incident and was met by a woman named Captain Adès Morrow, who was her escort, and also, clearly, the person who had called her the night before. Morrow was 35, precise in her movements, and said almost nothing between the security desk and the third-floor conference room, which Nora appreciated. The room held 4 people: Morrow, 2 members of the review board, a colonel and a civilian administrator, and a woman Nora hadn't expected. She was 62, gray-haired, and she was sitting with the careful posture of someone who had come prepared for this to be hard. Her name was Dr. Helena Voss. She had been one of the 2 medical personnel present during the Kessler evacuation. She'd been the other medic on the team, the one Nora had been closest to, which was the word the general had used, and which was true only in the limited sense that you could be close to someone during 18 months of shared operational stress. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. Voss looked at her when she came in. Nora looked back. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was its own kind of communication. The colonel, his name was Brandt, 60s, the specific tiredness of a man who had spent a career making decisions about other people's careers, opened the session with the formal language required and then, fairly quickly, dispensed with it. Dr. Voss submitted a statement 2 days ago as part of the declassification review, Brandt said. We've asked her to be present today so that you can hear it directly and have the opportunity to respond. All right, Nora said. Voss unfolded a piece of paper. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up. I'm going to read it, she said, and then you can ask me whatever you want. Okay, Nora said. Voss read. The statement was 6 paragraphs. The first 3 covered what Nora already knew: the evacuation, the order, the deviation, the soldier. The 4th paragraph covered Voss's original testimony, what she'd said and what she'd been told when she was informed it wouldn't be included. The 5th paragraph was the one that mattered. In the week following the Kessler operation, Voss had been called to a secondary debrief with Tallinn, alone, without the standard witness presence that protocol required. Tallinn had told her, not ordered because an order could be documented, but told, in the way that people in positions of authority tell things to people below them when they want the result of an order without the record of one. that her account of the evacuation was operationally sensitive, and that any further discussion of the events of that day, in any context, would be treated as a breach of classified information protocols. She had understood the implication. She had complied. For 3 years, Voss said, setting the paper down, I told myself it was the classification, that there were reasons I didn't have full visibility into, that the process had worked the way it was supposed to. She paused. I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what I'd been told to stay quiet about. She looked at Nora. I'm sorry. Nora was quiet for a moment. You were in a position that made silence feel like the only option, she said. I understand that. Understanding it doesn't mean it was right. No, Nora said. It doesn't. The room held that for a moment. Brant looked between them, then returned to his notes. The 6th paragraph, he said. Dr. Voss, can you summarize? Voss picked up the paper again. After the informal debrief, I witnessed Colonel Tallon placing a call to the Personnel Division of the Medical Corps. I wasn't supposed to be in the room for that call. I'd come back because I'd left something. She paused. I heard him tell the person on the other end that Major Vance's separation should be processed at maximum categorization, that her record should be flagged in a way that would prevent reinstatement or civilian medical licensure in any federally regulated capacity. Nora's hands were flat on the table. The civilian administrator was writing. He used the word prevented, Voss said. Specifically. Brant looked at Nora. Did you know this? No, she said. I knew the separation was processed unusually quickly. I didn't know the mechanism. The flag was placed, Brant said. We found it in your file 2 hours ago when we did the full document pull. It had been embedded in a supplementary administrative notation that wasn't part of the standard separation record. Correctly placed, it would have made reinstatement of your military medical license functionally impossible through normal channels. He paused. It was incorrectly placed, whether by error or by someone who understood what they were doing and chose to put it where it would be found eventually. We don't know. Someone had protected her, quietly, years ago, in a way that had given her the civilian credentialing path she'd taken. She didn't know who. She might never know. Some things stayed unresolved, and you learned to carry them. What happens now? She said. Brant exchanged a look with the civilian administrator. The board will issue a formal finding within 72 hours, he said. Given the documentation, the suppressed testimony, Dr. Voss's statement, the flag in your file, the finding is not in question. It will be a full reversal of the disciplinary action and a restoration of your rank and record. He paused. Your separation will be reclassified as honorable. She heard him. She had been waiting to hear something like this for 3 years, and she had spent 3 years preparing herself not to need it, and she discovered, sitting in a federal conference room at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning, that the preparation had worked and hadn't worked in equal measure. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the release she might have expected. She felt something more complicated, the specific weight of being given back something you'd restructured yourself around losing, which was not the same as joy and was not the same as grief and was not, despite what some people assumed, simply relief. Colonel Tallon, she said. What happens to him? That's a separate process, Brant said. The IG's office will be notified of Dr. Voss's statement regarding the informal debrief and the phone call. The flag in your file will be part of that referral. He's been retired for 2 years, so administrative consequences are limited, but the IG referral has no timeline restrictions. He paused. He will be investigated. The record of what he did will be documented and made official. It wasn't a prosecution. It might not result in one. He was 80-something, retired, living somewhere outside the orbit of any of this. But the record, the official, documented, unredacted record, that was not nothing. All right, she said. She called Weston from the parking lot. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting. They're issuing the finding within 72 hours, she said. Full reversal. A pause. Good. Voss was there. A longer pause. I know. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure she'd come. You should have told me. Yes, he said. I should have. He didn't make excuses for it, which she appreciated. Are you all right? She thought about the question. She was standing in a federal parking lot in Portland at 9:30 in the morning with 2 hours of driving ahead of her and a hospital she had technically been reinstated at, and a life in Sutter Falls that was the same life it had been yesterday, and was also not, in ways she didn't fully have language for yet. "I will be," she said. "That's enough," he said. She drove back. The story broke publicly on Friday. Not the full story. The full story was the kind that lived in official documents and legal proceedings and took years to become legible to the outside world. What broke was the immediate shape of it. Kendall Peak Medical Center, federal billing investigation, department chair suspended, federal charges pending. That was the outer frame. Inside the frame, the parts that traveled faster because they were more human-shaped. A nurse who had saved a patient's life and been suspended for it, an administrator who had used that suspension to try to bury a financial fraud, an investigation that had caught him. By Saturday, Nora's name was in it. Not in the way she would have chosen. Nothing she could control was ever in a form she would have chosen. But the account, as it appeared in the regional news and then in a few national outlets that picked up the hospital angle, was accurate in its essentials. Nurse suspended after OR intervention. Billing fraud exposed in same department. Suspension lifted. Federal investigation ongoing. The military piece followed on Sunday, a separate story from a different reporter who had better sources. Ex-military medical officer. Separated under disputed circumstances. Review board finding imminent. That piece had the photograph Nora had never been able to prevent from existing. The one taken before everything, in a different set of clothes, with a different name attached to the caption, but the same face. She read both stories at her kitchen table with coffee that was actually hot this time. She felt, reading them, the thing she always felt when her own story was being told by someone else. The slight wrongness of it, the gaps and compressions, the way narrative imposed a shape that real experience refused. It wasn't inaccurate. It was incomplete in ways that couldn't be fixed, because the complete version was hers, and only hers, and couldn't be handed to a stranger and remain what it was. She turned her phone over. There were 47 messages she hadn't read yet. She read Paul's first. It said, "Called it. You okay?" She responded, "Yes, stop hovering." He sent back a single emoji, which she chose to interpret as agreement. On Monday, the hospital board met in a session that was partly formal proceeding and partly the organized aftermath of a very bad week. Ferris presented the IG's preliminary findings on the billing irregularities, the scope of which had grown as the audit deepened. The 4-year total had reached a number that made the board chair visibly uncomfortable. The compliance plan they approved in response was extensive and would take the better part of a year to implement. Sproat's departmental suspension became a formal termination at the conclusion of that session. The state medical board's process was slower, as medical board processes always were, but Nalini had filed her formal report the previous Thursday, and the review was already scheduled. The pattern of conduct, the complaint against Nora, the Ogle situation, the retaliatory performance review, would be part of the record. Professional license reviews took time, but the time would pass and the review would conclude, and the conclusion was not uncertain to anyone who had read what Nalini had read. Ogle, who had driven 40 minutes to tell the truth in a conference room, went back to his retirement. He sent Nora a card, an actual paper card, which was a thing she hadn't received in years. That said only, "I should have fought it then. Better late." She put it on the kitchen table for a while. Then she put it in the lockbox, not because it needed to be secured, but because it was the place where she kept things that mattered. Dana Marsh, in a conversation with Holt that she initiated and that lasted longer than she expected, said that she'd been thinking about what it meant to step back. Not just the specific step back in OR3, but the pattern it had come from, the deference, the assumption that her own read of a situation was less reliable than the room's consensus. They talked for 40 minutes. Holt was, she discovered, better at this kind of conversation than she would have predicted. He'd been doing it with himself for 22 years, just quietly. He didn't say what he thought about the situation with Nora. He didn't say much about Sproat either, but she knew he'd declined 2 invitations to speak in Sproat's defense during the board process and in the particular ecosystem of hospital politics. What you declined said as much as what you did. Nora returned to work on a Tuesday. She wore her badge, the same one she'd worn through 3 years of surgical prep and floor support and medication reconciliation, and the 14 days of suspension that had felt, at certain hours, like the entire weight of every choice she'd ever made. She clipped it to her jacket and walked through the main entrance at 6:45 in the morning and went to the nursing station on the surgical floor. Paul was there. He looked at her for a moment. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Since when?" she said. "Since I made it 20 minutes ago, specifically because you were coming back today." She poured a cup. It was good. Better than the usual, which meant he'd used the decent beans he kept in his desk for occasions he didn't admit to planning for. She drank it at the station while he caught her up on 2 weeks of unit news, which he did in the compressed, efficient style of someone who had learned that she didn't need context she could infer. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. Then they got to work. By 8 o'clock, she was in a rhythm. By 10, the unit had recalibrated around her presence the way units always did. Some acknowledgement, some deliberate normalcy, a few people who looked at her slightly longer than usual before looking away. Marco found a reason to come up from the OR and said, "Glad you're back," in the way that men like Marco said things they meant without wanting to make a thing of it. She said, "Thanks," in the same register, and that was the entirety of it. Osman appeared at 11, visibly sleep-deprived and carrying a patient chart. "Question," he said. "What?" "The pressure recheck interval you used in conference room B, every 8 minutes. Is that from a specific protocol, or is it your own modification of the standard?" She looked at him. He had his pen out. He was genuinely asking. "Modified," she said. "Standard interval is 10 to 15 minutes in low-resource triage. 8 accounts for the higher acuity composition of that patient group given the mechanism of injury." He wrote it down. "Can you walk me through the reasoning?" She looked at the chart she was holding. Then she set it down and spent 6 minutes walking him through it, which turned into 12 minutes because he had follow-up questions that were good questions, the kind that meant he was thinking underneath what she was saying rather than just collecting information. He was going to be a real doctor someday. He already mostly was. "Write it up," she said when they'd finished. "Formally, your account of the triage protocol from that afternoon. Put it in the department record." "I thought you, He stopped. "Is that going to be a problem? Given the circumstances?" "The circumstances have changed," she said. "Write it up." He wrote it up. The review board's formal finding arrived on Wednesday, 71 hours after Brandt had said 72, which told her something about how much of the work had already been done before she'd walked into that room. She read it at the kitchen table. The language was formal, dense, with procedural citation, the kind of document designed to be unambiguous about what it meant without being emotional about meaning it. Disciplinary action reversed. Record corrected. Service categorized as honorable. Rank of major formally reinstated in the historical record. Flag removed. At the bottom, a separate section she hadn't expected, a formal commendation appended to the reinstated record, citing the events of the Kessler operation. The soldier's name was there, not in a way that identified him publicly, but in the official record, his life attached to a decision she'd made in a drainage ditch. The language called it an act of exceptional medical judgment under combat conditions that resulted in the preservation of life at significant personal and professional risk. She read that section twice. She was not, in general, a person who needed external validation of her own judgments. She knew what she'd done. She'd known it was right when she'd done it, and the knowing hadn't required a document to remain true. But there was something. She'd been trying to name it since the conference room in Portland, since Voss's paper unfolding on the table. Something that the document gave her that she hadn't known she was missing. Not the validation. The permanence. The fact that somewhere in an official archive, the record existed in a form that couldn't be recalled or redacted or embedded in a supplementary notation where no one would find it. The truth was in the record. That was not everything. It was not a repaired career or recovered years or an accounting for every door that had been closed while Tollin's phone call did its quiet, durable damage. It was not those things. It was enough. She put the document down. She looked out the window. The morning was overcast, the mountains behind the clouds, the street outside ordinary. She thought about the version of herself that had arrived in Sutter Falls almost 3 years ago. The specific discipline of building a small life, doing the work in front of her, being useful in whatever way she was permitted to be useful. She had been, she understood now, waiting without admitting she was waiting. Holding a shape, keeping herself intact for something she hadn't let herself call by its right name. She picked up her phone and called the number Weston had given her for Bertram Lurie. He answered on the third ring. His voice was old, genuinely old, the way voices got in the last decade of a long life, but alert. He'd been expecting her call. Weston had warned him it might come. "Ms. Vance," he said. "Mr. Lurie," she said, "I understand you've been working on this for a long time." 2 years, he said, give or take. "I wanted to thank you." A pause. "My son is alive," he said. "He has a wife, 2 daughters. He coaches his older girls' soccer team on Saturday mornings." Another pause, and she could hear him deciding whether to say the next part. "He doesn't remember the evacuation. The injuries were significant. There are gaps. He knows the broad shape of what happened, but not the specifics." "That's all right," she said. "He knows someone came back for him. He's always known that much." The old man's voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who had been through enough to know how to hold difficult things without dropping them. "He asked me to tell you, if I ever spoke with you, that he's had a good life, that he hopes you've had one too." She sat with that for a moment. "Tell him yes," she said. "Tell him I'm working on it." A small sound on the other end that might have been a laugh. "I'll tell him." They talked for another few minutes. Not about the case, not about Tallinn or the board, or any of the machinery that had been grinding for 3 years. About Sutter Falls, which Bertram Lurie had visited once in 1987 and remembered as being cold. About his granddaughters, who were 7 and 4 and who had inherited their father's inability to sit still. About small things. The kind of things you talk about when the hard part is over and there's space for the ordinary. When she hung up, the kitchen was quiet. She finished her coffee. She got dressed. She drove to work. 6 weeks later, Ferris called her into the administrator's office. This was different from the last time she'd been called into an administrator's office, which had been the beginning of a suspension. This felt different. Ferris had a quality of purposefulness that was legible even from the doorway, and she gestured to the chair across from her desk without preamble. "I'm going to make a proposal," Ferris said. "You can take time to think about it." "All right. We're building a new framework for trauma and mass casualty preparedness. The tanker incident exposed significant gaps in our response protocols, which you already know because you diagnosed them in real time and filled them in a conference room with 2 nurses and a resident." Ferris set a folder on the desk between them. "The board has approved a new position, Director of Trauma Preparedness and Emergency Response Integration. It's a hybrid clinical and administrative role. The person in it would develop and oversee our MCI protocols, lead simulation training for the department, and serve as the point of coordination with county emergency management." Nora looked at the folder. She didn't open it. "You're asking me," she said. "I'm asking you. I'm a floor nurse." "You were a military medical officer with combat triage experience who spent 3 years doing floor nursing because it was what you were allowed to do," Ferris said. She said it without softness, which Nora appreciated. Softness would have been condescending. "The credential pathway for the director role requires a clinical background that you have and an emergency management background that you also have, if the military record is part of what's on the table. And it is." Nora looked out the window. The parking lot was visible, the mountains past it, the overcast that had been sitting over the city for 3 days beginning to thin at the edges. "There's a condition," she said. Ferris waited. "The simulation training. I want it open to all clinical staff, not just attending physicians, nurses, techs, residents, everyone who's going to be in a room when something goes wrong." She paused. "People perform better in crisis when they've practiced the decision, not just the procedure. That means everyone practices." Ferris looked at her for a moment. "That's a significant scope expansion." "I know. It's also what the tanker incident showed we needed. I'll take it to the board." "If the board says no, the offer isn't interesting to me," Nora said. Not because I'm negotiating, because the piece I'm unwilling to compromise on is the piece that matters. Ferris considered this. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something at the bottom of the page in the folder. I'll put it forward as a requirement, she said, not a preference. Thank you. Think about the offer, Ferris said. Take whatever time you need. Nora stood. I don't need time, she said. Yes. She moved her locker on a Thursday. Not the contents, just the location. From the surgical prep wing to the staff corridor outside the new trauma prep office, which was a converted administrative room on the second floor with 2 windows and a whiteboard and a door that had a nameplate being printed. It was a room that smelled like old carpet and institutional paint. She stood in it for a few minutes, looking at the whiteboard, at the windows, at the empty space that would become something. She thought about what she was going to build here and what it was going to take and the ways it was going to be harder than she expected, because things were always harder than you expected. And the people who did them anyway were not the ones who'd been spared difficulty. They were the ones who'd been through it and kept their hands steady. She picked up a marker and wrote 3 things on the whiteboard. Not a plan, just the beginning of a shape. Priorities, sequence, first principles. The kind of thinking she did before she started, so that when she started, she was moving in a direction. Her phone buzzed. A text from Paul. Heard you took the job. Good. Then, 30 seconds later, also heard you made open training a condition. Obviously. Then, Osmond says he wants to be first in the simulation cohort. I told him to get in line. She wrote a 4th thing on the whiteboard. Below it, she drew a line, and below the line, she began a list that was the actual work. The unglamorous, logistical, phone call making, budget fighting, protocol writing work that building something real required. The kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside and was, in her experience, the only kind that lasted. A trauma alert sounded somewhere in the building. The overhead system, distant from the second floor, a 3-tone sequence that meant incoming critical. She capped the marker. There were people downstairs handling it. Good people. Paul, who knew more than he gave himself credit for. Dana Marsh, who had stepped back once and would never step back the same way again. Osmond, writing things down with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the writing was part of the medicine. She had time, for the first time in a long time, to let them handle it. Not because she was stepping away, because she was building something so they'd be better when she wasn't there. That was the difference. She'd been learning it her whole career, and she understood it now in a way that went below the professional into the personal, into the part of herself that had spent 3 years in a city that didn't know her name being useful in the ways she was permitted, and waiting, without admitting it, for permission she'd never actually needed. You didn't wait for someone to see what you were worth. You showed up. You did the work. You kept your hands steady in the rooms where things went wrong, and you stayed until the crisis resolved, and then you went back and you built something better than what existed before. That was the whole of it. Not the commendation, though it was real. Not the restored rank, though it mattered. Not the reversal of a document that had for 3 years said something about her that was false. Those were the record being corrected, and the record being correct was important. She believed that, would always believe it. But the work was the work. The work had always been the work. In a drainage ditch in OR3, in a conference room with 2 nurses who'd never done mass casualty triage, in a whiteboard room on the second floor of a hospital in a city that now knew her name. She picked up her bag. She went downstairs. Not to the trauma bay. She wasn't needed there. And she knew the difference now, finally, between being needed and being present. She went to the training room adjacent to the simulation lab that had been approved last week, that would be operational in 6, and she sat down with the curriculum framework she'd been sketching for 2 weeks, and she worked. For an hour, nobody came in. The building moved around her, overhead pages, rolling carts, the sound of the hospital being itself, the ordinary noise of a place doing what it was built to do. Then Osmond knocked on the open door. "Can I help?" he said. She looked at him. He had his notebook. He always had his notebook. "Yes," she said. "Close the door." He closed it. "I'm building the simulation curriculum," she said. "I need someone who remembers what it's like to not know things, what it actually feels like to be in a crisis without enough information." She looked at him. "You're the most recently new person I have access to. You're going to tell me where the gaps are. He pulled up a chair. Okay. Start with the day of the tanker, she said. Walk me through everything you didn't know. He thought about it. Then he started talking. She listened and wrote, and when he said something that cracked open a gap she hadn't seen, she asked the question underneath it, and when he didn't have an answer, she wrote the question down, because the questions you couldn't answer were the ones that built the curriculum. Outside, the city was carrying on. Bertram Lurie's granddaughters were somewhere being 4 and 7. A man who had been carried out of a drainage ditch was coaching a soccer practice he didn't know had been the destination of a choice made in the worst circumstances available. Somewhere, an 80-something retired colonel was living a life that was going to be interrupted eventually by a process he'd thought he'd escaped. Not fast, not dramatic, but documented and therefore inevitable. Somewhere, a board was processing the end of Randall Sproat's department chair career, and a medical board was reviewing his license, and a federal attorney was building a fraud case that had his name at the center of it. It would take time. It would become public in ways that were specific and consequential and appropriate to what he'd done. That was happening, and it would continue happening without her in the room, because the machinery of accountability, when it actually engaged, didn't need her supervision. She was here, in this room, with this notebook, with this work. The woman everyone had overlooked was building the system that would make sure fewer people died the next time the city broke open. She didn't need anyone to see it. She just needed to get it right. That had always been enough. That had, from the beginning, been the whole point.